This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. The torment of precautions often exceeds the dangers to be avoided. It is sometimes better to abandon one's self to destiny. Napoleon Bonaparte. The title of this series, The Civil War in the Southwest, it sounds like I'm going to be going deep into the history of the battles that occurred in New Mexico and Arizona. I mean, of course I will be. But the lead up to the Civil War and the decision to invade these territories by a rebel government, a government that needed all available men to defend the home front, they still sent men west. Talking about the Civil War in the Southwest, it requires a global historical perspective, more than one would think. The United States Civil War did not occur in a bubble, and worldwide events pushed each side into making their decisions. In order to enjoy the context of such battles as Valverde or Glorietta Pass, or the last Lance Charge in North America, or the pack mule IEDs, one needs to understand why those soldiers were killing one another in such a quote-unquote desolate land in the first place. So not only will I be talking a lot about New Mexico, but I will also mention Arizona and Texas, Utah, California, Oregon, Mexico, Haiti, Nicaragua, Russia, Prussia, France, and England. I had no idea how international the conflict was, despite my lifelong fascination with the Civil War. I am from Georgia. I had no idea how international the conflict was until I began reading for this series. And boy, did I read. A lot. And now I'm going to share what I learned with y'all. This won't be your typical textbook version of Civil War history about slavery and states' rights and all that, although those play an enormous role. In this series, especially the first few episodes, I will put the United States Civil War into an international context that I doubt most listeners have probably ever heard of, or even thought about, really. I know I hadn't. So get your boots on, grab your blue or gray overcoat, ready your rifle, and let's march into the history of the Civil War in the American Southwest. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% Made in America clothing, by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That is buffalowoolco.com. The first thing I'm going to say as a sort of disclaimer, just so that my listeners and those that stumble upon this corner of history, just so they know, and so no one is confused, I believe that slavery is evil. And I am proud of our nation for abolishing it. The Civil War of the United States of America, in hindsight, appears to have been inevitable. Of course, that is not how history works, and there were many times that the catastrophe could have been avoided. But even from the start of the Revolutionary War, the country was divided between two factions. At that time, it was the Loyalists and the Patriots. Loyalists wanted to stay with England, and after the war they would head to Canada. The Patriots wanted freedom from Britain and to create a new nation under God. But even among the Patriots, those that wanted to avail themselves of what they saw as a tyrannical crown, even among the Patriots, the warring nation was split between Northerners and Southerners. The Southerners were dominated by that original English colony, Virginia, while the North was centered in New England, in cities like Philadelphia and Boston and New York. Adams, among others, led the Northerners, while the Virginians were led by Washington and Jefferson and others as well. Both those men, they owned slaves. But both men knew that slavery must one day end in the United States. The question to them, especially Jefferson, was how and when. While Washington would be the first commander-in-chief, Jefferson was not far behind him. In the end, Jefferson's beliefs and policies, they would lead to a further division among the Patriots, now Americans, more so than Washington's brief but effective term as president would. But in reality, the president after Washington, the New Englander, Adams, he would also greatly divide the nation with his Federalist agenda. Jefferson's own views about the new republic and slavery are pretty fascinating, and I truly believe we would be a much different nation if we had abided by his policies and his hopes for the future. I'm not sure if that future would have been better or the same as now. Well, it wouldn't have been the same, but Jefferson's ideas wanted to take the nation on a course similar to that of the Roman Republic. Jefferson saw the nation as a republic where all citizens were equal. Key word being citizens, because not everyone living in America would have been a citizen. He and many other founding fathers believed that all citizens would be noble farmers who would and must earn their citizenship. They accomplished this mostly through owning land, becoming a citizen. The closest example to Jefferson's idea of a nation and its citizens in recent memory would be a nation like Rhodesia. You must own a certain amount of land to be a citizen and to participate in the politics of the nation. If you do not own land, this was true in Rhodesia, not in the U.S., if you did not own land, but you wanted to be a citizen, then you could prove you were worthy of such citizenship by making enough money for the nation's economy or by passing certain aptitude tests, maybe what we would call IQ tests. Passing these tests would have given you the ability to make decisions for the future of the nation. Jefferson never entertained the idea of such tests, mostly because I don't think they were around, but in his view, only landowners could vote. If you own land, if you own some of the soil, if you have roots, as Jefferson's thinking went, then you have skin in the game. Your goals would be the preservation of not only your land, but your country's land as well. Because your country protected you. Hence why they named the president the commander-in-chief, and why he was in charge of the military. He was the head of the armed forces. And the commander-in-chief's ultimate goal was to protect the nation against enemies, both foreign and domestic. An important phrase there, too. Foreign and domestic, without and within. Really, the phrase should have been reversed. But by becoming a citizen and holding land that you would pass down to your progeny, your children, the Founding Fathers were essentially taking the idea of a monarchy and spreading it around to the citizens. A monarch wants to protect his kingdom because he wants his kingdom to succeed and grow and prosper. So a monarch will do whatever is in his power, if he's a good and worthy one. He's going to do whatever he could to preserve his kingdom, or as we call it today, nation. Jefferson and the Founding Fathers took that notion and abolished what they saw as the tyrannical monarchy and aristocracy, and they spread that responsibility and patriarchal leadership amongst the citizens. If you were a landed citizen, like the Ancien Regime kings in France, then you would desire the greatest outcome for your kingdom and your children and your children's children, and so on. Universal suffrage and citizenship would have been abhorrent and unthinkable to most of the Founding Fathers, especially those from Virginia, like Jefferson. Jefferson's view on slavery was obviously conflicting. The estimable Darrell Cooper of Martyr Made is currently doing a series for his Substack subscribers, and it goes into the history of slavery with regards to the lead up to the Civil War. Now, in typical DC fashion, he begins his lengthy series at the beginning, quite literally before recorded history. For y'all, I'm just going to start with Thomas Jefferson. But in part 14 of Darrell Cooper's series, he finally brings up the Founding Fathers, and especially Thomas Jefferson. And Darrell taught me some good history, which I will quote from. Now, we all know that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, but few know that he had quite a few rough drafts before the final document, and much of what he wrote in those drafts was cut out by the Continental Congress. One such passage that he wrote that got trimmed was a diatribe against the king and the African slavery that Jefferson felt the king and England had forced upon the United States. That's how he saw it. He wrote in that first draft, quote, "The king has waged war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people, who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, determined to keep open the market where men could be bought and sold. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He is now exciting these very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has denied, by murdering the people upon whom he also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another." End quote. So in this rant towards the king, he is blaming the king and England for capturing and buying blacks from Africa and dangerously, lethally, transporting them to America to work in the fields of England's colonies. Jefferson personally blames the King of England for bringing slavery to the U.S. He then says, rightfully so, that after forcing this slavery upon us Americans, he says that after forcing slavery upon America with your soldiers and ships and commerce, now that we are fighting against you, the king, are exciting the slaves to open rebellion, which could very well lead to the slaughter of all of us white patriots. Now, I will go into this a little bit more shortly because what he's saying is true and factual. England, in her war against the Patriots, was inciting violence among the slaves in the South and the North, but mostly in the South. And the king was advocating for free and bonded slaves to take up arms against the colonists. And England will continue this, possibly violent propaganda, right up until the Civil War. They will also advocate this abolitionism on the island of Saint-Domingue, what we call today Haiti. Jefferson, though, while clearly writing with hatred about the institution of slavery, while writing this, He owned slaves. He had them in his home, outside his home. He had them working the fields and cleaning his plantation. When he was 21 years old, Jefferson inherited 5,000 acres and 52 slaves. He would never free these slaves, mind you, but it is clear from his writings and his attitudes, from a young age, that he detested slavery. And he wasn't the only founding father who did. Here's Darrell Cooper summing up the moral quandary of a people demanding freedom from tyranny while commanding tyranny themselves. The moral problem of a people fighting for their liberty while holding 500,000 slaves in subjugation was becoming an unavoidable contradiction. The problem was not confined to salons in the northern cities either. Revulsion for slavery was felt even in the South, and even among many slaveholders themselves. It is easy to dismiss them as mere hypocrites, but these men had to deal with practical problems flowing from what to us, with benefit of hindsight, and far from the consequences of any decision, are uncompromising moral declarations. These were not men who could easily violate the principles without suffering the full psychological consequences, and they genuinely struggled when their principles seemed to contradict each other. End quote. For this series, I read an incredibly interesting book by a Canadian historian and author named Jeffrey Zvingrowski. He wrote Jefferson Davis, Napoleonic France, and the Nature of Confederate Ideology from 1815 to 1870. He too started his book at the Revolution and with Thomas Jefferson. I read his book lightning fast, despite it being incredibly dense. It had quotes, personages, politics, speeches, laws, declarations, people. It was one heck of a book, and I will be quoting from it heavily, mostly in these first few episodes. One quote about Thomas Jefferson that speaks to his view on emancipation by Zvingrowski is this, quote, Jefferson wanted black slaves to be gradually emancipated, but he did not desire to extend free blacks' equality or fraternity within the Union. End quote. This, by the way, will be the view of future CSA or Confederate States of America President Jefferson Davis. But more on him in the next episode. Thomas Jefferson did see that freeing the slaves was inevitable, but he had reservations on how it should be carried out. He simply could not fathom a nation such as the one he had just helped to create. He could not see the United States as being anything other than a white, agrarian, and egalitarian nation built on Christian beliefs. He believed the U.S. would not survive if it let in a flood of people who did not share the Anglo-Christian values that the Founding Fathers had. Only problem for Jefferson was that there was already a flood of non-Anglo, non-Christian people that had been violently forced to relocate to these hallowed shores. Here's Darrell Cooper on Jefferson again. Quote, blacks, he believed, Thomas Jefferson, blacks, he believed, would prove unequal to the demands of liberty, and whites, even if they overcame their initial prejudice, would resent having to carry them. He's now quoting Thomas Jefferson. I advance it as a suspicion only, that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both mind and body. The unfortunate difference in color and perhaps in faculty is a powerful obstacle to the emancipation of these people. Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, and probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race. End all quotes. Jefferson did not believe that blacks were capable of enjoying the free society the Founding Fathers were building. Jefferson also believed that eventually violence would erupt between the two distinct peoples, the blacks and the whites, the masters and the slaves. It was a fear that all slaveholders had, and a fear that slaveholders have had since the beginning of slavery. Spartacus in Rome comes to mind, What did the Roman Republic do to the slaves who participated in the slave uprising in 71 BC? Well, Spartacus was killed, and then his 6,000 followers were crucified alive, all of them. And they were crucified evenly along the 100-mile road from Capua to Rome, as a warning to all future slaves. Revolt equals death. Now, just to be clear, that's one crucified, rotting corpse every 88 feet for 100 miles. Jefferson would not only be alive, but he would be president and commander-in-chief of the U.S. when this very horrific slave rebellion would play out again, but in the opposite direction. It is probably the only successful slave revolt in the history of the world. It was the slave revolt on Saint-Domingue. Washington, however, he saw the end of his slaves as important enough to demand such an action in his will. This is what he wrote 6 months before his death. Quote, "Upon the death of my wife, it is my will and desire that all the slaves which I hold in my own right shall receive their freedom. I do hereby expressly forbid the sale of any slave I may die possessed of, under any pretense whatsoever." End quote. He was serious, but he also wrote that, quote, "This clause respecting slaves in every part thereof be religiously fulfilled without evasion, neglect, or delay." End quote. Clearly, the Founding Fathers, they had a complicated and tortured relationship to slavery, both before and after they helped their nation gain independence from England. But how much independence did the U.S. really gain after the Revolution? Now, this is important, because when Jefferson Davis espouses the necessity of secession in 1861, he called it the Second Revolutionary War against the Yankees. He wasn't only talking about secession from the North, but instead from an occupied country. From the very beginning of the United States of America, Britain never ceased to harass the new quote-unquote independent nation. Even after the smoke cleared from the battlefields and the treaty was signed, England never quit, and may have actually increased her practice of consistently abducting American naval vessels and the men aboard them for her own use. England had been practicing this forced impressment of sailors, whom they had captured, since the Anglo-Saxon era of that island. It did not cease just because one of her colonies became a little uppity and split. And again, it seemingly increased after the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is mostly because of one particular emperor of the French, a certain Napoleon Bonaparte. England's war against the Emperor of France forced England to use the United States of America as essentially a pawn. In these first 2 episodes of the introduction to the Civil War in the Southwest, I will be talking a lot about Napoleon I and eventually Napoleon III. They both play a key role in the making of the Confederate States of America and her decisions before and during the Civil War. So from the beginning of the Union's independence, England was theoretically enslaving men whom she found on the high seas and forcing them to be in the Royal Navy, regardless of their country of origin. During the Napoleonic Wars, from 1793 to 1812, England would increase her navy from 135 ships to 584. And those ships weren't manned by drones, they were heavily manned by human men. England, during that same period, also increased her personnel from 36,000 seamen to 114,000. Of course, many of them were captured in England proper when they woke up from a drunken stupor aboard a ship. But many others had been pressed at sea when their vessels were overtaken by the Royal Navy. And many of those men who were overtaken at sea were Americans. Obviously, the United States did not care for this illegal seizure of men and equipment, but also this will directly lead to the outbreak of the War of 1812. But this forced impressment isn't the only factor that led to that war. Both before and after the American Revolution, England was also arming and supplying the new America's greatest threat, the Indians. This was mostly done from her forts and ports in Canada around the Great Lakes, but the Crown's reach was immense. In 1803, with the stroke of a pen, Thomas Jefferson, a future admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte, but in 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought Louisiana from the Emperor Napoleon, which gave the U.S. 828,000 additional square miles. A lot of this land became known as the Northwest Territory, which included Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and some of Minnesota. And immediately after the purchase, Americans flocked to the region they were already kinda exploring and branching out into, really. England, still having possession of Canada, was fearful of American expansionism, so because of that they regularly armed and trained bands and tribes of Indians to repel, kill, and massacre American frontiersmen and their settlements. England has a long history, which they passed to us, I suppose, in the middle of the 20th century, but they have a long history of arming various worldwide rebels and rebellions to accomplish their own aims. I know I just kind of brushed over this arming of the Indians, but I can't spend too much time on Tecumseh and the War of 1812, and America's aims of procuring a lot of Canada. Actually, I will go into that later, especially when I talk about the progression of the 19th century and the influence of the then Democrat warhawk Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis. But before and after the Revolution, England was impressing America's sailors, England was arming the Indians and causing havoc on the frontier, and England was attempting to restrict the new nation's trade with America's oldest ally, France. So now let's go back to the Revolutionary War. If you'll recall from your various history books and history podcasts, the nearly bankrupt Kingdom of France, which had been around for almost 1,000 years at that time, France, under the newly crowned Louis XVI, he faithfully backed the revolutionary patriots in America during her war against England. England and France have a long history of animosity, which had recently flared up again in what Americans call the French and Indian War, which itself was an extension of the 7 Years' War, which itself was a global conflict, and it saw an immense amount of death. And this conflict is why the Founding Fathers told future Americans, us, not to entangle ourselves in European conflicts. If only we had listened. Well, during the French and Indian War, future patriots and their fathers fought against the French and her Indian allies. But by the time the Revolution rolled around, Francophiles like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, they gained the support of France by way of 63 warships, 22,000 sailors, and 12,000 soldiers, all of them French. We would not have gained our independence without France's help. It is as simple as that. This help, though, would come at a high price for France, namely the French Revolution. Now, I don't think the French Revolution would have happened if France had not directly involved herself in the American Revolution. For history on the French Revolution, listen to Mike Duncan. But I'm still going to talk a lot about it because it would have immense consequences for two nations important to this story. Those two nations being the U.S., obviously, the other being Saint-Domingue, or Haiti. Because of the French Revolution and its abject horror that was the Red Terror, Napoleon Bonaparte famously, quote, found the crown of France in the gutter. I picked it up with the tip of my sword and cleaned it and placed it atop my own head. End quote. I love that quote. I have mixed feelings on Napoleon. I have the most famous portrait of him atop the horse crossing the Alps. That painting hangs in my office. I also have far too many books about the man, including this beautiful, large, leather-bound tome. I found it being given away for free in a box on the sidewalks of Menton, France. This, gorgeously illustrated and thick book is all in French, so I can only, open it and look at the pretty pictures. But Napoleon was a great man of history. Whether you ascribe to that theory or not, it is undeniable that Napoleon, like Washington, and a few others in recent memory, it is undeniable that great men are able to move the chess pieces of the world with considerable ease and bravado. Napoleon, like Caesar, was a man that modern men can learn from, even better themselves by studying them. But Napoleon is not without his faults. And that is, in my opinion, also true of American men like Thomas Jefferson. At first, Thomas Jefferson despised Napoleon's despotic tendencies. You have to understand, patriots like Jefferson wanted an egalitarian society where all free white men were equal. This is actually a very important view of Jefferson's that will be passed down to future Democrats like someone I will talk about soon, named Calhoun. But also to the man who was named after Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson Davis. So at first, Thomas Jefferson saw Napoleon as another King George, another tyrant. But eventually, Jefferson and other Southern Democrats would grow to greatly admire Bonaparte. But at first, Jefferson called him a scoundrel and a betrayer of the French Revolution. Which, yes, Napoleon did betray the French Revolution, but have you read about the Montagnards, the Jacobins? Have you read about what the Crazy Reds were doing? Despite his initial feelings, Jefferson much preferred alliance with the French than with the English. In 1807, Jefferson wrote to a fellow Democrat and said, quote, "I never expected to be under the necessity of wishing success to Bonaparte, but the English, being equally tyrannical at sea as he is on land, and that tyranny bearing on us in every point of either honor or interest, I say, down with England. And as for what Bonaparte is then to do to us, let us trust to the chapter of accidents. I cannot, with the Federalist Englishmen, prefer a certain present evil to a future hypothetical one." End quote. This very exact same sentiment, especially the "let the French do to us what they want as long as England isn't doing it," that sentiment, it has a long-lasting impact on future Southern Democrats, especially Calhoun and Jefferson Davis, and by extension, the Confederate States of America. That Federalist Englishmen that Thomas Jefferson refers to are American men in the North, like Adams, that will eventually become known as Republicans. But that's a few decades away. So initially, Jefferson and other Democrats, especially Southern Democrats, they were initially leery of Napoleon's success, but they were frustrated by England's blockade against France, which stopped them from being able to do business with and to trade with that country. The South, especially, wanted and needed to keep their cotton trade alive, that industry that relied almost entirely on slave labor. The Southern Democrats, like Jefferson, also began to see the picture that Napoleon was painting in his militaristic domination of Europe. The Democrats would come to see during Napoleon's overtaking and overthrowing of monarchy after monarchy. In his crusade to create a United States of Europe, they saw that Napoleon may not be the tyrant the Democrats first thought he was. Sure, Napoleon would place his own family and friends as the new monarchs in each nation he just conquered. But at least everywhere he went, he created new constitutions, he created parliaments, he abolished the aristocracy and their titles, while also spreading suffrage to, and here's the key, white Europeans. Jefferson and especially his Southern Democrat friends and a few in the North, but the Democrats soon began to worship Napoleon. Now, it should be said Napoleon absolutely believed in the supremacy of the white Europeans, and that was a view that Jefferson and his Democrats also held. And Napoleon would eventually extend his white supremacist view to France's most productive colony in the world, Saint-Domingue. For a history on the Haitian Revolution, I again point you towards Mike Duncan's Revolutions podcast. But essentially, after the American Revolution spread to France, it jumped the pond again and landed in the Caribbean. Saint-Domingue is one half of the island of Hispaniola. The other half is the Dominican Republic. Saint-Domingue, though, was France's most profitable colony on account of its sugarcane. And sugarcane is notoriously difficult and unpleasant to harvest and manufacture for use in the production of sugar. Many accounts of slavery on the island points to a very bleak situation. Dan Carlin, the king of podcasting, history podcasting himself, also covered Haiti's rebellion in one of his episodes, but unfortunately some of the sources he used were inaccurate. Regardless, it was awful to be a slave in Saint-Domingue. It's awful to be a slave anywhere. But Saint-Domingue was particularly bad. Saint-Domingue also became notorious because of its demographics. The island was made up of 500,000 slaves, along with 28,000 freed blacks and only 32,000 whites. There were over 16 blacks, half of them from Africa, 16 blacks to every one Frenchman. Eventually, buoyed by the French Revolution's promises of liberté, égalité, fraternité, in 1793, the abolitionists Frontenac and the Jacobins freed the blacks. These blacks then, after a decade of debacle and battle, they would eventually kill every single white French man, woman, and child on the island that did not escape to the United States or France. Some 25,000 French whites would ultimately be murdered. And on top of that, 75,000 French troops would die. Now, of course, on the flip side, around 200,000 blacks would be killed. Not all by whites. They did have some civil wars in there. But the whole affair was a horrendous, sad, and bloody saga. This atrocious act of history, it was the Southern slaveholders' greatest fear. An actual successful slave rebellion that would see the whites massacred, and many blacks as well. This was Thomas Jefferson's worst nightmare. Now, there are a ton of reasons this massacre happened, and those reasons are for someone else to dive into, and it has been dove into recently. But because of this whole revolutionary thing, Napoleon would send 31,000 troops to reestablish French rule on the island in 1803. But of those 31,000, only 7,000 or 8,000 would end up fighting. The rest would die of disease. I mean, this resistance to disease was one of the main driving forces of African slavery in the first place. The Africans could survive in conditions where whites could not. But in response to Napoleon's invasion of Haiti, England mustered the largest force she had yet in her history mustered. And England sent this force out to conquer the Caribbean and destroy, quote, the power of France in these pestilent islands, end quote. The entire time during this long and bloody slave rebellion on future Haiti, England had been, you guessed it, supplying the slaves and rebels with weapons. They briefly took the Dominican Republic and smuggled them across the border, just like they'd been doing in North America with the Indians against the Americans. And just like they would do in Mexico with the Juaristas, which I will talk about later. And just like they did during the American Revolution with the slaves England herself had brought to America. The U.S. was viewing all of this business down in Haiti with suspicion and abject horror. Many Americans saw Napoleon at first as a threat because some assumed that he would reconquer Louisiana, and maybe he would have, but that threat disappeared with the disastrous Haiti campaign. Other Americans, especially in the South, saw England's meddling and rapidly growing abolitionist views as a much more severe threat to the Republic than France trying to reclaim her colony. Americans like John Adams, he was preceded by George Washington, making him the second president of the U.S., and he served as president from 1797 to 1801. Adams was a Federalist who preferred banks over farming, preferred a strong federal government over strong states governments, and he preferred England over France. And during the Haitian Revolution, Adams, along with the British, he assisted the slaves on the island, horrifying Democrats like Jefferson, who would become president after Adams. Jefferson, as president, would immediately cease assisting the ex-slaves. Jefferson could not fathom the same thing happening in the United States that had happened to the whites in Haiti. The same thing England was pushing for. For decades after the Revolutionary War, English abolitionists would publish and disseminate abolition literature in the North with the hopes that it would find its way to the South. They'd advocated for a slave rebellion during the Revolution, remember? They didn't stop after the Revolution, even after seeing what this rhetoric did on the island of Hispaniola, to Haiti. While the French Revolution did ultimately end slavery in the French Napoleonic Empire, and Napoleon himself would spread abolition wherever he went, he was not an egalitarian when it came to the races. After Haiti, Napoleon sent the French army to Algeria, Vietnam, Senegal, and a slew of other colonies in Africa and Asia for the purpose of restoring white French rule. Bonapartists detested slavery in every way, but they were also white supremacists, much like Thomas Jefferson. And as I mentioned earlier, Jefferson would eventually come to admire Napoleon. Because of the Napoleonic Wars, and because of the aforementioned English meddling in the U.S., the War of 1812 happened, and that war saw England reasserting its dominance over the United States. Sure, the U.S. repelled the English, especially at the very French city of New Orleans, under Andrew Jackson, but the English still burned the White House and much of D.C. During that war, America also invaded Canada, but we were repelled by the Indians, and mostly the American loyalists who had fled there decades before, and also the English. And very consequentially for our story, politics in the U.S. became even more divided after the War of 1812. Northern Federalists and Democrat Republicans, which will be the future Republican Party, they wanted an alliance with England, while the Southern Jeffersonian Democrats wanted to strengthen ties with Napoleonic France. After the Napoleonic Wars, which saw Napoleon deposed and England re-monarching the entire continent, many French veterans, generals, and leaders, they all headed to the United States. And once there, they would influence the young nation's institutions. Many of Bonaparte's generals wound up in cities like Savannah, Charleston, Mobile, and obviously New Orleans. And many of these men would influence the politics of the upper-class Southerners in those regions. But not all of them headed to the South. It would be, in my opinion, impossible to argue that Napoleon was not a military genius. Napoleon revolutionized conventional warfare. His ability and skill to win through outmaneuvering, which would then cause the enemy to surrender, it was unparalleled at his time. This outmaneuvering would cause not just surrender, but defeat, which then saw Napoleon's armies sweeping through the opposing nations and kingdoms. This genius rubbed off on many of his subordinates, and many of them would find themselves in America at such prestigious places like West Point, the Army Academy. Once there, many of them, at the request of American politicians, they would attempt to remake the U.S. Army into a Napoleonic one. One Bonaparte aide-de-camp, who became an American citizen, Simon Bernard, he would end up influencing the then Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun, a man who wanted to conquer all of North America for the United States, especially British North America, aka Canada. John C. Calhoun plays an enormous role in this lead up to the Civil War. Calhoun was born in South Carolina in 1782. He got a good education, he went to Yale, and eventually he became a congressman. Once in Washington, Calhoun became one of the leaders of the Jeffersonian Democratic Warhawks, and he was a huge pusher for declaring war on England in 1812. He would end up drafting a declaration of war in which he accused England at various times in the document of having, quote, lust for power, unbounded tyranny, and mad ambition, end quote. After the War of 1812, Calhoun was deeply unimpressed with the performance and mismanagement of the U.S. Army. He had, after all, wanted to conquer both British North America and British Caribbean. So he sought to remedy the Army's faults. And that is when Simon Bernard enters the story and influences Calhoun. Bernard suggested that the U.S. should build forts on the coast from Louisiana to Maine, just in case the English invaded again. Other ex-Bonapartists had Calhoun's ear as well, and they told him that the U.S. should build more roads and canals in the interior of the nation, as well as a good system of communication. Although the period after the War of 1812 is sometimes referred to as the era of good feelings, meaning good feelings between America and England, there were many Americans and politicians, especially in the South, that felt like another war very well could be imminent with England. The war had been somewhat of an embarrassment for the U.S., and a lot of that was because as soon as Napoleon abdicated the throne, England sent a bunch of hardened veterans of that conflict to the U.S. England also sent hundreds of men from the Caribbean and India to fight U.S. soldiers. And once on shore, England burned D.C. and freed 3,000 black slaves in the South before sending them to resettle in the British Caribbean. The South would not forget this. And as I mentioned, immediately after the War of 1812, England began flooding New England with abolitionist literature and ideas, especially at Calhoun's alma mater of Yale. Simon Bernard held Calhoun in respect, and Calhoun held Napoleon in respect. Later in life, Calhoun would say of Napoleon, quote, "The overthrow of Bonaparte was followed throughout Europe by a powerful reaction against the popular principles of which our government rests, and to which, through the influence of our example, the French Revolution was traced." End quote. Calhoun was disgusted by the British undoing of what Napoleon had done in Europe. Many in the South had seen Napoleon's actions and interpreted them as creating a United States of Europe, which they thought was based on the United States of America. Calhoun feared that England, like they had done in Europe, wanted to undo the U.S. Revolution, something they had tried to do twice already. So Calhoun listened to the ex-Bonapartists and he agreed. The interior should be strengthened. The army should be overhauled. The federal government needed to have a stronger presence when it came to protection in the military, but, as opposed to the Federalists, not a stronger presence in the lives of Americans. Another key push the ex-Bonapartists insisted was that the U.S. should accomplish full industrialization. This, though, clashed with Calhoun's Jeffersonian democratic beliefs. Because like Jefferson, and like future CSA President Jefferson Davis, John C. Calhoun feared and fought against an English-style inequality among whites in the U.S. Calhoun, like Jefferson, wanted a nation of equal whites with no hierarchy among them. Like Jefferson and many other Southerners, Calhoun very much sought an egalitarian equality for American citizens, white American citizens. These Southerners truly believed that if white Americans stayed equal, that they would surpass England easily. Calhoun also believed once America surpassed the fortunes of England, that a future war with her would be inevitable. Hence his warhawk status and why he wanted to strengthen the U.S. military. Now in the end, these calls for forts and roads and canals would either be ignored or met with hostility in Washington. Mostly because of that era of goodwill but also because Washington wanted closer ties to their twice enemy, England. After Andrew Jackson's victory at New Orleans, Calhoun became an ardent supporter of the general and future president. During Jackson's presidency, Calhoun was his vice president. Also, interestingly, Calhoun had been vice president for the administration before with John Quincy Adams. So he was vice president for two different presidents, and he's the only one to do so thus far. In 1824, John Quincy Adams would be elected president, and he would immediately seek to be closer to England. He also began to strengthen the northwest interior as opposed to the entire interior, which included the South, much to his Vice President Calhoun's dismay and frustration. John Quincy Adams would also encourage immense growth and industrialization in the North at the expense of the South. But Adams' biggest affront to his vice president and the other Southern Jeffersonian Democrats was his promotion of racial equality, while at the same time promoting inequality among whites. After Adams, the war hero of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson, was elected, and Calhoun was again vice president. And while vice president, Calhoun pushed Jackson to remove what he saw as the traitorous, treasonous Indians from the South. He did this mostly because he and other Southerners believed that the Indians were receiving British aid and weapons. Now, this was certainly true in the North at this time. Indians in Michigan, backed by the English in Canada, had just recently attacked a fort and then scalped the men in charge of the fort before mutilating their bodies. And this was happening at the same time that the Federalists in the North, like John Quincy Adams, were advocating for and romanticizing the Indians as a peaceful people who were unjustly conquered. Which reminds me of the Pueblo Mystique, and how early Indian agents to the Apache felt too. It's a theme I recently learned is still taught in public schools to this day. The Pueblo Mystique is apparently not only reserved for the Puebloans of the Southwest. Calhoun, Jackson, and other Southern Democrats saw this sympathetic view towards the Indians as traitorous, and they blamed the English. So it is clear that from the very beginning of the nation, but especially after the War of 1812, the North and the South were at odds. The Northern Federalists preferred an alliance with England, especially after the War of 1812, while some Southerners, the ones more in danger from the Caribbean and from their west, they wanted fortifications and a strong army. The Southerners also wanted a more egalitarian white society. To further advocate for this, Jackson and Calhoun won the quote-unquote bank war, in which they stopped a national bank from forming. They believed that this bank would mostly only benefit northern elites and ultimately create a nation even further divided into classes. Eventually, shortly after the War of 1812, federalism would be destroyed, but the sentiments remained, especially in New England. Although there would be some holdouts in the South, especially in my home state of Georgia. And those sentiments included a desire to be closer to England. Jeffrey Zvengrowski mentions a group of influential New England Federalists, which were at that time given the name Essex Junto, possibly Essex Junto. And that is because they were mostly from Essex County, Massachusetts. But Zvengrowski sums up how the South saw these New Englanders, who were led by a radical New England secessionist named Timothy Pickering. But Zvengrowski sums up how the South saw these radicals in a long but great quote. Essex Junto New England Federalists, like Timothy Pickering, after all, supposedly sought to institute British-style class, ethnic, and religious hierarchies among whites, embracing British abolitionism at the same time by enfranchising blacks to diminish the political power and social status of lower-class whites. Rejecting Jeffersonian democratic plans to gradually eliminate slavery without challenging white rule so that blacks could be removed from the United States in the end, They had also ostensibly worked to turn the Union, or at least a seceded New England, into a submissive British ally against Bonapartist France. And many New England Federalists did look to the British for protection from Napoleon I, whom they loathed for espousing égalité, fraternité, and to a lesser extent, liberté among whites, even as Calhoun-type Jeffersonian Democrats hailed him for championing what they took to be the basic democratic principles of the American and French revolutions. End quote. And yes, every single paragraph of Sven Grauski's book is that thick. It was a great book. But if at any time your mind wanders, you've got to reread however much you just missed, or else the next paragraph won't make any sense. So this was the atmosphere of the 1810s and 1820s in the American nation. New England preferred England and wanted to secede from the Union, which they threatened, or abolish it altogether, which they also threatened, many times, while Southerners preferred Napoleon's France, and they wanted égalité, fraternité, and liberté among whites, while slowly absolving themselves of black slaves. Calhoun would eventually have a falling out with Jackson, but Calhoun would stick around in politics nearly up until he died. During his time as a senator and Secretary of State in the 1830s and 1840s, Calhoun sought massive industrialization for the South in unison with the North, and he sought federal oversight for this very objective. He even wanted to use black slave labor under the control of the federal government, and, of course, watchful eye of a powerful militia. He wanted these black slaves to build infrastructure in the South, like railroads and factories and again canals. Jeffrey Sven Grauski wrote about how Calhoun saw these slaves. Quote, "Blacks, after all, were not childlike charges in Calhoun's view, but instead a brutishly hostile race to be controlled by, quote, the stern and powerful will of the government, if the feeble and flexible will of a master, end quote, would not suffice." End all quotes. So Calhoun had no problem in using black slaves to further the nation, and he wanted the powerful federal government to oversee this growth in infrastructure, especially in the South. A growth he hoped would rival the North until eventually overtaking it, and by extension, overtaking England. The South actually did use black labor in coal, copper, and gold mines in places like Virginia and Georgia. But Calhoun wanted to increase this use of the South's slaves. He could not see the nation, and especially the South, grow and compete with England if slavery were abolished. In 1838, he remarked that if slavery were abolished, the abolitionists in the North would then work to lower the Southern whites to a place below the blacks, which is a sentiment that was proven somewhat correct during Reconstruction, something that he would not live to see. Now, I know this is a lot of political history and intrigue, but I'm not quite done yet. Because in 1838, something big went down in a place known as the Republic of Texas. I will not be going into the history of the annexation of Texas, but it was an important catalyst to the Civil War. And actually, the Civil War almost started in Texas. And I will get into that in the third episode, which is the last episode before the actual Civil War in the Southwest starts. Under Calhoun as Secretary of War for President Tyler, the United States annexed Texas and made it a slave state. In a surprising bit of historical fact that I did not know, which this episode is filled with, but Calhoun and other Southern Democrats greatly feared at this time that the English were after Texas, and that they were going to take, quote, exclusive control of the cotton trade, end quote. And this control was a grave threat to the, quote, very existence of the South, end quote. Those were Calhoun's words. But ultimately, Texas went to the United States. In the next episode, I will introduce the most important Southern man during the Civil War, future President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. I will also talk about the War Hawks' hope for an expanded America and Napoleon III's rise to power. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest. This episode is graciously sponsored by one of my new favorite companies, the Buffalo Wool Co. Y'all know I have great love and respect for America's national mammal, the bison. My very first episode was over the wild and woolly beast, so when I tell you I discovered a company that makes 100% bison wool products, 100% in America, you know how excited I got. The Buffalo Wool Co. makes the most incredible and comfortable socks you've ever worn. Not only are the Buffalo Wool Co. socks comfortable, but they are warm. You can wear them in the house, to bed, or on a hike. I wore mine in the sands of Great Sand Dunes National Park, and I've worn my Buffalo Wool Co. socks while hunting in the northern forests of Wisconsin. I plan on wearing them for the rest of my life. Buffalo Wool Co. 100% guarantees you will love the product or your money back. The owners of Buffalo Wool Co. have been raising bison in North Texas for almost 30 years, and they're even more passionate about the amazing animals than I am. Buffalo Wool Co. not only makes socks, but also knit caps, gloves, scarves, and extremely warm and comfortable clothing for kids. My wife and I have a little one on the way, and I will absolutely be keeping our kids snug and warm with the Buffalo Wool Co.'s expanding brand. If you like being comfortable and warm and looking awesome while doing it, and if you support 100% made in America clothing, by people who are passionate about these animals and the ranchers who raise them, you will love the Buffalo Wool Co. Head over to their website, thebuffalowoolco.com, or my website, theamericansouthwest.com, where there will be a link on the home page. That is buffalowoolco.com.